Channing was still in complete disbelief about what he had managed to achieve. He had escaped the van, his plan coming to life, and the sewers spread all around him, bringing along with them a world of possibilities. They were certainly a labyrinth of darkness, the air thick with the stench of decay and stagnant water. But after living in the van for weeks now, and witnessing the madness which was going on around him, he was not going to complain. Being under the ground, which was constantly being roamed with zombies at all ends, gave him some modicum of safety, and that was all that he truly needed. He moved cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The beam of light flickered weakly all around him, barely illuminating the tunnel ahead. But that was the best he had. The tiny rays of sunlight shining through barely broken manholes helped him as well. But that was not the main problem. The main problem was finding a destination which he could navigate through the sewers. He knew it was not going to be easy. He had already been walking for hours now, his thick boots sloshing through the murky water. His mind raced with every sound that reached him, making him wonder if it might be coming from inside the sewers or from the streets above him. Even though the sewers were supposed to be his escape, his way out of the nightmare he was caught up in, along with everyone else. Something felt off. As the walls closed in around him, making them narrower from some places and much wider from the others, he felt as if he was being followed. He wished to shake the feeling away, blaming it on paranoia, but he was truly not certain about any of it. Behind him, the faint sound of splashing echoed through the tunnel, making him freeze in spot. His heart pounded loudly while his breath came out in ragged gasps. He turned around slowly, the beam of his flashlight sweeping in the darkness behind him. He could see nothing and no one. Breathing a sigh of relief, Channing walked forward, but he could feel something was just not right. After living in a van for weeks, right in the middle of the street, which was always teeming with zombies, Channing was well aware of how they seemed to operate, and nothing could fool him anymore. He was sure he had closed the door of the manhole particularly well when he had gotten inside. If someone else would have tried to come in after him, he would have surely noticed. But he still could not deny that the sewers were huge and spreading around him in all four directions. A zombie could have already been inside or might have gotten in from another manhole. Channing could not shake off the possibilities, but he was still sure he would have heard it if it had happened in that manner. Despite that, he decided to keep his eyes open and his mind ready in order to attack or run if need be. He was not going to take any risks after working so hard to find an escape for himself. As Channing walked further into the maze spreading in front of him, his confusion continued to grow. He could not understand where he was going or how he would ever be able to find a way outside. Manholes were all around him on different intervals, but he could still hear the undead out above on the streets, which made him sure that he could not enter in those areas. If he did, he would only be walking into the middle of a death sentence. He continued walking, his mind focused on the sounds coming from above. After a few more hours, it felt as if the sounds were beginning to decrease on some level, but Channing was not sure still. Every little footstep felt suspicious to him, and Channing did not wish to make any mistakes. He stepped another foot forward when suddenly a splash sounded behind him. He froze on spot, certain that someone was there. Without alerting whoever it was, Channing turned around slowly. For a moment, there was nothing. And then he saw it. A pair of glowing eyes, reflecting the light like a predator of the night, were right behind him, staring ominously at him. Channing was so shocked that he did not even think about moving, his mind thrown in utter chaos and confusion. How had this happened? He had made sure that no one was behind him, but this zombie had appeared. Channing took a discreet step backwards, but the zombie lunged towards him anyway. The creature's guttural growl echoed through the tunnel, forcing Channing to stumble in the darkness, his flashlight slipping from his grasp. The tunnel was immediately plunged in complete darkness, with nothing but the zombie's eyes glowing wildly inside it. Channing knew the creature already had an advantage over him, since it could see in the darkness, while Channing was left directionless. Without waiting to find his flashlight in the murky wetness covering his feet, he simply turned and ran forward, his boots splashing through the water. His breath came out in ragged gasps as he continued to run, knowing fully well the zombie was right behind him. Channing suddenly saw a much smaller tunnel running in the other direction and tried to duck inside it in order to hide. He stayed there for several seconds, waiting for the zombie to pass him by without noticing him, and to his surprise, that did end up happening. The zombie ran forward while Channing stayed there. Channing could hear the zombie somewhere in the sewers, its claws scraping against the walls as it continually pursued him. Just one single scratch of those claws, and Channing would turn into one of them. That was the last thing he wanted. He walked a few steps further, trying to see back out in the main tunnel to check if the zombie had disappeared, but suddenly, heavy breathing sounds began to come from right behind him. Channing instinctively ducked, just as a clawed hand attacked the wall. He had been leaning again, and he noticed how the zombie had somehow managed to come behind him. He did not know that was even possible, but the glowing red eyes of the insolent creature did not leave Channing any room to think. The only thing he knew was that he needed to run as quickly as possible. After that, Channing did not stop. He simply couldn't. He ran through the darkness, his hands brushing against the walls to guide him in regards to direction. In order to avoid the zombie as much as he could, he simply continued to run forward, trying to take sharp cuts and impossible directions in order to confuse the creature. The zombie had erratic and uncoordinated movements, which worked in Channing's favor, allowing him to run much quicker and managing to escape one way or the other. That was all he wanted to do. The tunnel somehow seemed to stretch on forever before him, the sound of the zombie's growls growing louder with every step, no matter how much Channing decided to leave the creature behind. But Channing knew he couldn't run forever. Exhaustion was already creeping in. Just as his legs began to give out, he saw a faint glimmer of light shining from a broken manhole. Channing knew his best bet on survival was somehow getting out of here. He had no other options. The light grew brighter as he ran towards it, his hope surging with every step. He knew he was going in the right direction, and this would be his only ticket out of this place. He had to try. The tunnel grew wider around him, opening into a large chamber, the ceiling high above him. He listened closely, trying to find any zombie sounds above him, but to his surprise, there were none. The only sounds were of the zombie from inside the sewers, who was still at some distance. But Channing needed to be quick. He noticed how sunlight streamed inside the dark tunnel through a grate, illuminating the space and casting long shadows on the walls. He was forced to squint as direct sunlight hit him, not having access to it for weeks now. The van had been not the best place to get sunlight, and for the past several hours, he had been stuck in the sewer system. He looked in the tunnel, still unable to see the zombie. He felt safer. Without wasting any more time, Channing did not hesitate for once. He climbed the ladder to the grate and pushed it open, the fresh air hitting him like a slap. He quickly closed the grate behind him, once again, not wanting the zombie to follow after him at all. Once that was done, Channing felt as if he could finally breathe again and fell down on the ground underneath his feet. His breath was coming in loud gusts of air, and he felt as if he was having an anxiety attack. Escaping the zombie had not been easy at all, but he was grateful. After he finally felt slightly better, he sat back down, realizing that he had someone emerged onto the beach, the sand warm beneath his feet and body. Just at some distance, the ocean stretched out before him, the large waves crashing against the shore. Channing collapsed onto the sand, his body trembling with exhaustion. He had somehow done it. He was finally free. He rubbed his eyes, trying to make himself believe that this was not a dream, and he had truly somehow managed to escape. He had always loved everything about the ocean, and had always enjoyed coming out here. Now, in the middle of the tragedy he was stuck in, the ocean felt unreal. He felt as if landing here was a sign from God that he was going to survive. One way or the other, he would. But Channing did not want to be delusional. Despite that, he walked towards the waves, letting his feet dangle in the clean water. He wanted to do nothing but take off all his clothes and thoroughly clean himself in the ocean water. He was about to do just that when a crack in the air suddenly made him conscious. His relief was only short-lived. The sound of the manhole cover changing open behind him sent a chill down Channing's spine. He already knew what it meant, but every fiber of his body was forcing him to not want to find out more about it. But he knew he could not afford to ignore it as well. Channing turned at last, not knowing what else to do, and just as he had expected, the zombie which had been following him earlier climbed out of the sewer, its eyes still glowing red as they locked with Channing's. Before Channing could plan to fight the creature one way or the other, the zombie did something which Channing had never seen or even experienced before. It let out a guttural shout, the sound so loud that it echoed across the beach wildly. Channing's blood suddenly ran cold as he tried to make sense of the situation. The zombie was not just there to chase Channing, but it was calling for reinforcements. The shout had been a call for other zombies. Channing was almost certain of it. The creature kept shouting while taking slow steps towards Channing, who continually stepped backwards. What was Channing going to do now? Despite his confusion, Channing did not wait to see what would happen next. He simply scrambled to his feet and ran as fast as he possibly could, his boots sinking into the sand, making it even more difficult. The beach was entirely deserted, not one soul in sight. The sound of the crashing waves, which usually seemed so beautiful to him, seemed like nothing but a horror story. Now that Channing could see, he had nowhere to run ahead. He did not know how he was ever going to escape the zombie who was right behind him, still shouting manically. Suddenly, Channing began to hear footsteps behind him, coming from all directions. He stopped momentarily and turned around, his eyes growing wide at the sight before him. Throngs and throngs of zombies were running towards him from the city, as if the call had brought them all together. No matter what Channing did, even if he turned into Superman, he would never ever be able to defeat all of them all alone. He stopped gawking at them in pure horror, and instead busied himself in scanning the shoreline, looking for shelter or anything that might help him. And then he saw it. A small grocery store lay just at some distance, the darkened windows boarded up and doors hanging off its hinges. Channing sprinted towards the grocery store, his heart pounding, but the zombies behind him changed direction just as quickly and began to come after him. Channing wanted to both confuse and distract them, and he knew his best bet would be to use noise and movement. He changed his direction once again at the very last minute and ran into the lapping waves. He began to run manically in the water, creating as much noise as he possibly could, while the water swirled all around him. He looked like an idiot, but all he needed was for the plan to work. The zombies changed direction once again, now coming straight for Channing, who was in the water. He let them come ahead, their bodies dipping in the waves, and Channing could see how their movements grew even more uncoordinated. They certainly could not take the water. Once they were further inside, he bent downwards, trying to conceal himself in the frothy water, and beelined straight for the store, which was right there. The zombies had noticed him, but their movements were much slower, and Channing was confident he would reach the store much quicker than they would be able to. His heartbeat accelerated wildly as he burst inside and slammed the door shut behind him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The store was dark and cluttered, its shelves empty and overturned. The place had definitely been raided and looted. Despite all of it, it was still shelter and provided him with some modicum of safety, even if just for the moment. Channing moved through the store cautiously, his eyes continuing to scan the shadows before him. Despite finding shelter, he still wanted to be sure he was not being followed, or another zombie was not just inside it. As he explored further, albeit with caution, he found a back room, which seemed much safer against the zombies, which were already beginning to slam the front door of the grocery store by now. Channing got inside the back room and barricaded the door with a heavy shelf, his hands trembling as he worked on it. The zombies were right outside, their guttural shouts growing louder with every passing minute. Channing knew it was only a matter of time before they found a way in. He quickly grabbed a crowbar from the store's tool rack, quite happy that it had not been stolen yet, and prepared himself to fight for his life if necessary. Just as he had expected, the first zombie burst through the door, after creating a small entrance in it, its twisted form lunging towards Channing. Channing swung the crowbar at the zombie, the metal connecting with the zombie's skull with a sickening crunch. The creature collapsed to the floor, but Channing knew more of them were coming right behind the first one. But he had no intention to die. Channing fought back with everything he had in his body, his movements fueled by adrenaline and desperation. But just after the first few, he knew there were too many of them. They were pouring in one after the other through the small opening, but the opening was bound to get bigger until all of them entered inside together. Channing knew he couldn't fight them all, no matter how hard he tried. He still had to escape. Breathing in deeply, Channing zeroed in his gaze towards the back door, which was bolted from the inside, and discreetly grabbed his backpack. He got up and ran at once, the zombies behind him, pouring in one after the other from the entrance in the door. He unbolted the door and burst out of the store, once again sprinting down the beach, while his legs burnt with the effort. The zombies were relentless creatures, their guttural shouts echoing across the sand. But Channing did not stop. He ran until his legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the sand as the zombies closed in. It was over. He could not do it anymore. Just as he thought it was over, a sound of an engine reached him. Channing looked up, his heart leaping as a truck roared onto the beach, the headlights cutting through near darkness. The driver leaned out of the window, a rifle in his hand. "Get in," he shouted. Channing did not hesitate and scrambled to his feet with whatever strength was left in his body and climbed into the truck. The zombies almost reached him, falling short as the truck sped away, the beach fading into the distance just moments later. Channing was so exhausted, he almost felt as if he was passing out. He turned to look at the man who had saved him from a terrible fate and opened his mouth to ask a question. But his eyes closed instead, and everything turned to darkness.